Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we will be talking about what the Christian response should be to racism. But before we start, we wanted to open up in prayer and read a short passage of scripture. So I'll pray for us. Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for another day of life. Thank you for all the blessings that you've given us, even in this difficult year. I pray right now for this conversation that Ariana and I are about to have. I pray that you will give us the strength, the wisdom, and the knowledge about what we speak. And I pray for all those who are listening. I pray that they will pay attention to what we're saying, and I pray that it will bless somebody. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I will be reading from Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. That was from the NIV version, and I picked this verse, or we picked this verse, I should say, because I believe it shows how important to Jesus the least of these are. And the least of these, for those who don't understand, are the people in our society who are casted out, who are disadvantaged, who are disenfranchised, who aren't considered, and who are thought of least. So that's why we chose that verse. So before we get into our conversation, I just wanted to make a quick disclaimer. So when we say Christians or the church in our conversation, we want to clarify that we're not speaking of every single Christian or every single church. We are also not speaking on behalf of all Christians. We are simply sharing how we believe Christians should respond to racism based on the Bible. And lastly, I want to say that this is not a political discussion. Talking about racism has nothing to do with politics. It actually has a lot to do with, we believe, what God says how we should treat people. So, yeah. All right. So, a little bit about our topic. We believe that this topic was important to talk about because, as many of you know, since George Floyd was murdered by police in May, there has been so much conversation about, how Christians should respond to racism. However, we feel that what's been missing from the conversation is what the Christian's responsibility is to speaking out against racism or to getting involved in justice work. So that's why it was important for us to have this discussion, because we feel like many people aren't having this discussion. I don't know if Ariana wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, most definitely. I feel like, as you said, this is how we are to be as Christ followers, as Christians. It's really important for us to not overlook. And many times the Bible mentions justice and how important it is for us to prioritize justice. And so I 100% agree. This is an important conversation that every single pastor should be incorporating into their church. And I feel this is a conversation that is very important for every Christian household to be having as well.
Right. Yeah. So just to give a little bit of a history, we're not like history majors or history buffs, but just to give a general history of Christians' response to racism in the past, what many people I think overlook in history is how many Christians in America were directly involved in racism. So for example, with the transatlantic slavery, many people who were slave owners in the South, or many people who supported slavery, also claimed that they believed in God, to the point where they actually used the Bible to try to justify slavery and justify the dehumanization of the African slaves at the time. So I think when many people think slavery is something that is of the world, or that is of people who are not believers, and once you're saved, you can't be racist, those stuff are just simply not true, because these people were reading the same Bible we're reading today and took from it that they can treat other people this way. And I think another example of this that we can see is even when slavery was abolished and people were segregated, they also had to use racism to keep those lines, very clear. And they did that again through the Bible. There's like several different beliefs on this about how Black people are cursed, or how they're literally less than, they literally didn't even consider them human, like fully human in the Constitution. So I think people don't really think about that when we're talking about racism. We can't just look at it as something that's in the past, or something that, it happened. It's still something that many Christians were involved in then, and unfortunately, many Christians are involved in now. Yeah. Did you have anything to say to that, Ariana?
Nope, that sums it up perfectly.
Right, yeah. Okay, so going off of that, I know I've seen many ways that Christians have responded to racism, again, since George Floyd, that I believe goes against the way Christians really should respond. And so many people feel like if they're not killing a Black person, or if they didn't own slaves themselves, they themselves are not participating in racism. But I think a very common way that I've seen Christians respond to racism today is to use deflections. So I've heard several different deflections. I'm going to try to go over a couple of them. One of the first things I've seen is Christians being complicit with racism. And when I say complicit with racism, I mean when they see racism happening around them, like, so they hear a racist joke, or they I'm trying to think of a better example of this, but pretty much anytime racism is made very clear to them, they kind of feel like it's something that they don't really have to speak about. So for example, even seeing people in their church post stuff on social media that are quite frankly racist, they don't feel like they need to say anything against it at all. They don't. And then a lot of times these same people will be very upset and very vocal about the ways other people are responding against racism. So whether that be protesting, choosing to post about it, and etc. And so I think that's a very common deflection I've seen of people not saying anything themselves, not boldly speaking out against racism, not from the pulpit, not on social media and in their life, but they are using their platform to say, well, we shouldn't respond to racism this way. I know that's something I've seen a lot. I'm pretty sure you've seen it a lot too, Ariana. So that's one of the major ways. Another thing I think I've seen a lot is people trying to deflect and talk about Black on Black crime. And this is probably, I feel like, in my opinion, the age-old, very tired, stereotypical response that people have when Black people are calling out the police and the government for racist policies and practices. And the reason I believe this is a deflection and it's not helpful is, first and foremost, most people are only talking about Black on Black crime in response to a Black person being murdered by the police. You're never talking about Black on Black crime on a regular day, and you don't really actually think or care about the Black people that are impacted by Black on Black crime, as so you call it. Also, what many people don't understand is there's a big difference with two Black civilians killing each other and a police officer who's supposed to defend and serve you and protect you literally taking your life simply because of the color of your skin. So there's a very drastic difference. And I've seen some Christians go as far as to defend the police. Like, it's one thing if you have different opinions on how the police should be handled, but I've seen people even defend the police even when they've seen them, you know, be racist or uphold racist policies and practices. And I think many Christians do this because they feel that they're upholding the law, and they feel like as Christians are supposed to follow the law. Like, you know, the Bible does talk about following the law, but I think also these same Christians can understand when there's something in the law that's unjust, when there's something in the law that's not right and actually goes against your Christian values. This is not a law that you should uphold or praise, or feel like you need to defend. And I think that's something that many people are missing. Did you want to say anything to that?
Yeah, just like how slavery used to be legal, and it was legal. We all know it was legal, and
Yeah.
we're still unpacking that to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why, like, when we discuss systemic racism, we have to realize it is deeper than just police brutality. Like, we're still
Mm-hmm.
unpacking the trauma that was set in place in 1528 or 1508 when the first enslaved African set foot in America. We're still unpacking that, and I feel like it is literally our responsibility to be able to decipher between right and wrong, good and evil.
Right.
You have to be able to recognize when if it is legal and allowed for a human being, not just a police officer, like they are a human being, for them to purposely murder and treat another person unjustly because of their skin color. We have to recognize that that is that is not good. Like that is evil. It's rooted in evil. And then
Mm-hmm.
also to your point about black on black crime and the whole existence of that, you know, being myth and purposely used as a way to deflect the conversation of police brutality. It's important, like you said, to recognize the difference between a black person murdering another black person and a police officer murdering a black person because of their skin color. But it's so important to recognize that when the black person murders another black person, they are charged and arrested. And when the police officer, regardless of like if he's white or Hispanic and he murders another black person because of his skin color, he's not arrested or charged because the justice system doesn't work for black people the same way it does as white people. And as Christians, like we kind of want to overlook that until we're personally affected.
Mm.
That's like where the hypocritical, you know, practices come in because it's really evident in the church. Like this conversation happens all the time, and people choose not to have that conversation because they're guilty. Because if there's an issue that affects them personally, then all of a sudden it's like, well, let's talk about it, you know?
Right, right. And I think even sometimes, even when they're not guilty, because I've seen Black Christians use this excuse. I think I think most times it comes from a place of ignorance, like a simple ignorance of you just heard that all your life, so you just continue to use it, even if you don't really understand what that really means when you're saying that. I think another reason people use it a lot, whether Black or white Christians, I think is again so that they themselves don't really have to address the serious issue that racism is. If you can simply say, well, Black people shouldn't be saying Black Lives Matter because Black people kill people other places, you can then somehow justify, not justify, sorry, you can kind of separate yourself from that situation, especially as a Black Christian. You can say, well, I'm not one of those Black people because I know Black people kill other Black people and I have nothing to do with that. But when you realize that even if you're a Black person that's never killed a Black person, you can be, living in the nicest place, you can be the best Christian, you can still be impacted by police brutality and racism just because of the color of your skin. You realize, oh wait, it's not that simple of a situation. I can't deflect this onto somebody else. And I think a lot of times that's what it is. It wants to like push the blame to somebody else. And I think a lot of times it's not always just to be evil and to simply not want to care about other people. I think it's easier. It's really easy to just turn a blind eye to what's actually happening. I think my other big issue with Black on Black crime and the people that bring it up, Christian or not, is that they kind of refuse to realize the reason why there's high crime rates in, very densely populated Black areas is because, one, they were forced into these very densely only Black areas by redlining and segregation and et cetera. You can do the math with history. And then also they're put in these areas where they're disenfranchised. So like jobs move out from where they live. All the white people move out from where they live. And they're literally left in this community where they don't even have like their bare necessities sometimes, like even like a regular grocery store that sells like fresh fruits and vegetables. Most times they don't have these things. So imagine living in this area, you're in deep poverty. Your only way of really kind of climbing any type of social ladder is by joining with other people who may have weapons and stuff, because that's the way that they can defend themselves. Of course, in these areas, just like any other area, black or not, when you're in these densely impoverished, disenfranchised areas, there's going to be high crime rates, because what else are you doing? Like, you're literally fighting to survive in these areas. But people, even when they say black on black crime, they don't really care about the black people that are dying. They're again looking to blame black people. And again, I think that has a lot to do with racism and how we view black people. We're not taught in history or any time in life to really sympathize with black people. We're taught that, you know, we're taught literal racist things about black people. And so they kind of resonate even when we are black Christians or we are black people ourselves, or even people of color, because of the simple fact that that's kind of what we've been taught, but we never actually stop and think like, this actually affects real people. You know, I don't think people stop and think about that. I think they kind of think of it as a kind of like just like a political stance or whatever. It's too, you know, political, but they're not really thinking about the fact that this affects real families. Like, George Floyd's family is really impacted by him dying that way. Ahmaud Arbery's family is really impacted by him dying that way. Sandra Bland's family is really impacted. Like, all of these people's families are really impacted. It's not just this political discussion. These are real lives. And I don't think people think about that. And I think as Christians, especially as Christians, we have a higher standard to uphold, you know, like these are real people that are dying. And I think that's what people don't want to think about.
Yeah, of course. And then also to add, I feel like you were saying, a huge reason as to why a lot of Christians might choose not to because it's easier is because they might not necessarily, I guess, want to take the time to recognize how deeply rooted these problems are in like institutionalized and systemic racism, not just racism when it comes to microaggressions, but racism when it comes to redlining, like you stated, because there's obviously a huge difference in the way Black men are treated that have guns, whether it be registered or not, and white men being treated that are armed with AR-15s from the age of 10 years old, and they can freely walk around their schools and institutions and not get reprimanded for that. Just like the news of the young boy, I forgot his name, he was on a Zoom call in class this past week, and he had a toy gun on his classroom on Zoom, and he was suspended because of that toy gun that he had. And mind you, this is not even in-person classes, this is online classes. And then, what's her name? Is it Caitlin? Or not Caitlin?
Are you talking about the person that, like, is she like a personality, like a famous personality that's...
No, she's, you know what? I can get her name.
Okay.
1 second, because I know her name. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. Okay, right here. Her name is Caitlin Bennett, and she wore a AR-10 rifle for her graduation photos, and she was walking around her college campus with it, dangling all over her body, walking around town, showing off how proud she is to be a gun owner. And like, as Christians, we don't really take the time to recognize, the difference in treatment, because like I said, we're not directly affected by it. And of course, a lot of Christians might not necessarily own, weapons, or might not necessarily rely on those for their survival. And where the judging comes in, because we're like, oh, there's a young Black boy and he has a gun to protect himself and his family, and we automatically think like that is evil, and we don't associate that with the white men that are walking around with pocket knives, because we see that as protection. So we just take the time to recognize the difference in treatment, because it exists. It exists, and like you said, it is people that are directly affected by the harm behind like us choosing not to speak up about it.
Exactly. I think that's a really good point. I think it also goes to directly racism, like even what you're saying about how we look at different people. Like, I've heard Christians defend like people down south, and I'm guessing they're thinking of white people down south, who have guns, and like they go to restaurants, and I've never seen it myself, but I've heard of stories where they like, have like their big, I don't know the names of guns, but they're big guns, like assault rifles right there next to them while they're eating. And it's normal. It's their culture. It's their life. But the moment a Black person is shot and there's some by a police officer or a racist person, and there's some like idea that he might have had a weapon, it's all of a sudden this justification for them being murdered. So you don't see the difference of somebody having a gun just regularly, they're not even doing anything, but you can defend all day people having guns and just taking them with them just for fun. And that, I think that really highlights that point, is that we don't really take time to really question ourselves, like, why do I view this person doing it as okay and this other person as a criminal who deserves to be killed even though they were doing nothing? You know, that really does speak to the heart of the racism. I think another deflection that I've seen is people saying that it's causing division. And I feel like, or it's a distraction. Those two I think are very popular ones. And I remember I was discussing with you and I was thinking about it, like, we can say certain things that happen in this life that are on the news as Christians are distractions to us. I agree. But however, when we're talking about an issue, right, of racism, we can't say racism is a distraction, or the calls to fight against racism right now in our time are a distraction, because something that's been around for hundreds of years cannot be a distraction. Like, this was an issue for Christians in the 1600s or whenever the transatlantic slavery began. I'm kind of blanking on that. I think it was the 1600s. This was an issue for people 60 years ago. This was an issue for people 100 years ago. So the fact that we're in the same place in different ways just lets me know that this is not a distraction. This is definitely a issue of the heart. And I feel like it's an issue that Christians need to be serious about because it's a sin. And I think many Christians don't view it as a sin. And if you don't view it as a sin, you can kind of turn a blind eye. You can say ignorant things. You can witness people, you know, in your church or even like your pastor saying things that you know are wrong and be like, it's okay because it's not that big of a deal. And I think that's been one of the biggest deflections I've seen people use, is that, oh, this is causing division among the church. And we shouldn't really deal with that because it's distracting us from getting closer with God. And that's really not the truth. When in reality, if we took the time and really not just like let people out there deal with it, but as Christians look at our Bible, pray to God, and really like take a look at what we're doing and how we're responding to it and how we're maybe even upholding it in our churches, we then can start to see some change there. I'm not saying we can change the viewpoints of everybody and, you know, change this whole system. It's going to take a long time to do that, but that's a start, you know? And I don't think people are willing to have that start. They're willing to just kind of sweep it under the rug and say it's causing division and it's a distraction. Therefore, the church should have no say in it. I know I've heard that a lot.
That is so accurate. And I know another thing, this verse popped into mind. Isaiah 1 verse 17, it says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And I feel like, I think you touched this earlier a little bit, but a lot of Christians do a lot of picking and choosing of when they choose to title something as oppression or when they choose to title something as injustice, you know? And this ties into the hypocritical aspect as well, because I was talking to you before and I was saying, like, if somebody woke up and they noticed that someone had like crashed the windows in their car and scratched their car, and that's their property that they paid for, and that they care for, that they invested in, and somebody brutalized it, you know, they're going to take that issue seriously. They're going to take it to court. They're going to contact the police department locally. They're going to do anything they can to make sure that they receive justice. And to them, you know, that is an example of them needing to fight for justice, you know, but because they're not individually what's the word? Individually,
Affected?
yes, affected by racism, they don't recognize that the harm is even worse than a damaged vehicle, because a damaged vehicle is materialistic property. Like, they don't realize that the harm goes deep enough to affect you traumatically, like generationally. And
Right.
that's why they, not all, but I know a lot of white Christians, you know, that's why they don't necessarily view it as injustice, you know. So they do a lot of picking and choosing, and then they read a verse like this and like seek justice, and then that doesn't really, I guess, correlate to the kind of justice that Black people have been asking for over 400 years. And that's where the disconnect is. And so to them, they're like, oh, well, you're creating division. But the truth is the division has already been there. They just haven't been. And that's
Exactly.
really, really toxic, because not only are you supposed to bring more people to Christ, you're supposed to grow the kingdom, but you can't do that if you're unable to choose to love others that aren't like you. Like, you have to be able to understand like what the definition of love even means. We have to be able to love others, hold each other accountable, and understand each other despite our differences. And that's where we're really lacking, I feel like.
Right, right. And I think what you just said made me think about this tweet that I saw, and I have a screenshot of it. But it says, if your call for unity is void of justice, your understanding of unity is not a biblical unity. There are a lot of pastors pleading for unity because they are seeing the divisions of the world within their churches. Sadly, the unity many are calling for is a surface level unity. And I think that kind of covers what you're talking about. I think many people just don't want to deal with conflict. That's really what it is. And I mean, who likes conflict? Conflict is not fun. However, again, with something as serious as this is not going to blow away. Like, if we're alive or if the world continues 100 years from now, this is still going to be a problem if people don't seriously start to take it as a serious issue and not as a personal issue. Like, people need to really take it upon themselves, even if they're not directly impacted by it, because in some way, doesn't matter, what race you are, racism, as long as you're breathing the air, you're going to have some involvement in racism. It's just a part of our society. Like, I was literally thinking about it the other day. Like, I don't think I can think of a job or a profession that's not impacted by racism. Like, I'm pretty sure any Black person in any profession, from being a nurse to being a baseball player, can tell you about their experiences with racism. And so when you think about that, unless, we as Christians start to only live amongst each other, and even then, we're still going to have to confront it at some point. And I think people think they can kind of push it aside and it will go away, but in reality, it's going to keep coming up. So I think that was a good point. I think another thing that I've seen, again, we've seen a lot of deflections, but another deflection I've seen is people saying, like, especially in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, is that this is not what MLK would have wanted. It would not be what Martin King would have wanted, or he would not have supported the Black Lives Matter movement, or whatever. And actually, I think it's interesting because I follow his daughter on Twitter, and she actually always says the same people that say this would have hated my father, or the same people that say this don't understand what my father really stood for. And I think it's an important thing to acknowledge, one, because I think many people kind of look at the time of the civil rights movement as something in the past and something that we've overcome, and they don't see it as a continued struggle. So I think they kind of pull back to Martin Luther King as this guy who just had a dream of, like, just, color blindness, and they don't really look at what he was really calling for. And so I think those people that view it that way can almost see MLK as this person that's okay with oppression and stuff, as long as we're all unified. So even if you're killing me and you're treating me wrong, I'm still gonna hold arms with you and pray for you, because that's, what we should do. When in reality, although he was very serious about nonviolence, he also was really serious about civil disobedience. So I think he would have supported taking a knee. He was really serious about protesting. He was really serious about doing things that cause not a bad disturbance, but a disturbance so people can wake up to what's really happening. And that's what he did in that time. And so I think people will kind of try to use him as a way to be like, well, MLK wouldn't have wanted that, and I follow MLK, so that's it. And it's just, that's really not the truth. And I think it's interesting, even when I've read some of the things he said in response to, like, how certain Christians were in response to what he was doing. He felt that, especially obviously white Christians at that time, because there's segregation, but he felt that their silence, both the white Christians in the North that said that they were against segregation, as well as the silence of white Christians in the South, he said he felt that they would be their biggest champions. He thought that they would be with them. And he said they were actually some of the people that were the most against him. They were the people that, kind of similar to now, bring up these other, like, deflections, pretty much. He didn't say the word deflection, but bring up these things that have nothing to do with what we're really talking about. And I think when people, obviously many people don't really learn the truth about MLK, like, as in his whole story, I think people can easily just be like, well, I'm really more so trying to just be at peace, and they don't really understand what it takes to get to real peace, So I think that's interesting. Okay.
I agree. And I also want to add,
Yeah.
I know I've heard a lot of phrases along the lines of Martin Luther King Jr. would have done it peacefully. And this was in response to, the rioting and the looting, which also was not even 100% from the Black Lives Matter protesters. We already had to deal with that. But I've heard that a lot, like a lot, especially in the white church.
Mm.
And that also ties into toxic positivity, which I feel like is another big deflection that's used in a lot of churches nowadays. But it's think about this statement. Like Martin Luther King Jr. would have preferred a peaceful protest. Like really just think about that. And then recognize what happened to him after he peacefully protested.
Right.
Like
Right.
I just want Christians to really hear what they say, because all of these deflections don't even have an actual root meaning to them. They're just a phrase that they use as an excuse that sounds good to them and makes them feel, like you said, at peace. And that peace, like the tweet said, is not even biblical peace, because that's just like an excuse, you know?
Right.
Because Martin Luther King Jr. got shot too, and he was
Mm.
depicted like he was peacefully protesting, but he was depicted as violent, you know, in the media,
Mm.
in the news. Just like today, the only time you see Black Lives Matter protests on the news is when you see there's a lot of tension between the officers and the protesters. You never see any kind of form of peaceful protest being shown on the news, because that's the language of the oppressor. And like
Mm.
understanding the history of that is so important. And the fact that a lot of Christians and believers are feeding into that role, feeding into that system, is where it becomes toxic. And this is not just relevant in the white church. A lot of Black Christians have been saying this too, especially,
Mm.
you know, the wealthier Black people who feel like they just aren't the same as every other Black person. They feel like they're better. They feel like they escaped that issue. They feel like they're just not a part of the problem of racism anymore because they like fought their way out of it. And
Right.
like that just becomes toxic.
Yeah.
And toxic positivity is a real thing for you to say, oh, well, positive vibes only. I only want positive vibes around me. Like, think about saying that right in front of somebody that's literally asking you to see their pain and to help them in this
Mm.
fight. Like, imagine you saying that. Like, imagine your little daughter just fell on the floor and her knee is bleeding, and you're like, oh, well, positive vibes only. Let me get you a popsicle and leave you alone. I'm not going to wipe up the wound. I'm not going to give you a band aid. Let me just get you a popsicle. You know,
Right.
that's really what toxic positivity is doing. And
Right.
I was going to say earlier, but like we as believers need to be a part of this fight, because the fight needs more numbers. You know, like we need more people to be on our side so that we can really let everybody know like we're not playing any games. But
Right.
toxic
Right.
positivity does that. It's a deflection. And saying Martin Luther King Jr. would have preferred a peaceful protest is a deflection as well, because not only are you ignoring his story and his legacy, but you
Mm.
are ignoring the fact that you are trying to silence Black voices even more. You're trying to say that Black people need to protest a certain way in order for their voices to be heard. And if you look at history, it doesn't matter how they protest. Black voices
Mm.
will not be heard.
Right.
It's like there's so many levels to the deflections, and it's ridiculous. That's all.
Right. Yeah, and I think it goes into saying how old these deflections are. Like, I want to comment on what you said about Martin Luther King, but I think it just reminded me, like, even with black on black crime, which I think President Reagan started to deflect from, again, violence that was, I guess, violence with police officers, I think with like the war on drugs and stuff in the 80s. But anyways, what people don't understand is, like, people use the same kind of phrase with slavery, or people use this, not slavery, with lynching of black people. There were literally people that were saying, well, this is fine because look at the violence in their community. So it's pretty much, understand, when you're saying black on black crime, what you're really saying is, well, because somewhere else, unrelated to this person, a black person killed another person, you deserve to be killed too. That's literally what you're saying. So you're saying every black person, it's okay if they're killed because somewhere else there are black people that are killing each other, which ignores the fact of, one, like, again, think about, like you said, think about what you're really saying. Like, does that sound right? Does that sound Christian? Does that sound like okay at all? Then two, you're ignoring the fact that white people kill mostly white people. You're ignoring the fact that Asian people kill mostly Asian people. You're ignoring the fact that Latin Americans kill mostly other Latin Americans. Like, you're just ignoring this whole fact, and again, relying back on the stereotype. But then what I want to say about the Martin Luther King thing is, I think it has a lot to do with respectability politics. Even like certain black Christians, I feel like, that's not something that'll affect me. It's the respectability politics of it. So like the first thing they'll see when they hear about like a victim of police brutality is be like, oh, so what kind of clothes were they wearing? Like, oh, look at how they're dressed. That's kind of who they are. Well, I don't dress like that. Or if it's a woman, oh, did she talk back? Or like maybe she shouldn't have said anything. And what people don't understand is it doesn't matter what you do, because at this point, there's been so many examples. Like, Breonna Taylor was asleep. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You are still at, like, you're still at risk. Like, Black people are still at risk. So there's this respectability politic idea that because Martin Luther King, wore suits and, they were Christians and they're respectable, that's why they got respect. No, we're learning about it in the past. In that time, they were hated, like you said. Martin Luther King was considered the most dangerous person in America at the time that he was alive. The FBI was against him. I don't think people realize this. So we learn about him now as this great figure, because I feel like they can kind of use his nonviolence approach as meaning doing nothing. But in reality, what people don't realize is that respectability will not save you. Being a Christian even will not save you from this racism. And that is the point. And I think people just want to kind of ignore that, because again, I think a lot of it is maybe a defense mechanism. You want yourself to kind of feel like this will never happen to me or my loved one. But in the reality of it is that it could. The wrong place at the wrong time, unfortunately, it could. So yeah, that was a good point that you made. Another thing, another deflection, I know we talked about this, that I've seen Christians use, is that it's the end time. So because it's the end time and because God's gonna come back any second, we can't do anything. Let's not fight for anything, because that's really a distraction. Again, another distraction from getting us closer to God. And I have two comments to that. One, even if we are in the end time, right? Let's say we are in the end time. I feel like that's not an excuse to not do something. I think that's even more of a reason to do something. Like we want to be ready for when God comes. And like the verse I read in the beginning, while God does care about us being a Christian and being saved and having a good relationship with him, he also cares so much about how we treat other people. And Jesus talked about it so much. Like the words I read, they were in red. It was from what Jesus said. Jesus cared so much about how we treated people, and not just anybody, but the people that the society looked at as outcasts. I mean, he himself was considered an outcast. He wasn't loved by the people there. They hated him. That's why they crucified him. Like, people don't realize that as a Christian, it's so much more than just being the perfect Christian. How you treat people matters. And I think that part, to me, should tell you, if we're in the end time, it's more of a time than ever to be involved with things that are against a sin, such as racism, that is upheld in every single system and facet of our society. So that's, I think, I don't know if that was two things, but I think that's what I really wanted to say to that comment, is that it's not an excuse to not do something. I think it's more of a reason to do something. And the other thing, okay, sorry, I remember my second comment. The other thing is, even if, and let's say if it's not the end time, and you do have more of your life to live, you still again have to respond for how you did not respond in this time. And I think that's just my thought on that.
That's a really good point. And I was going to add another verse, Psalm 103, verse 6. It says, "The Lord works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed." And that backs up what you were saying as well. Because another excuse, like the end time. And like while we're here on this earth, we are called to be a certain way. We're called to act against evil. We are called to pray against evil. We're called to do so many things. The Bible is really specific about how he wants us to live our lives differently. Like when we walk into a room, we are supposed to be different. Like we're supposed to have, like we're supposed to shine bright. Like, you know what I mean? We are supposed to be different. And I feel like that a lot of times, like Christians take that into consideration, and they're like, oh, well, because we're supposed to be different, I'm not going to get involved with the same conversations that, like, everyone's talking about. I'm not going to get involved in politics. I'm not going to get involved with Black Lives Matter because it's divisive to all lives matter, whatever it may be. But like you're saying, it is so accurate, because we have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to recognize that this is not politics, this is a human rights issue. And we have to take into consideration the fact that God is so specific when he tells us that we have to stand up for the oppressed. We have to fight for justice. And I feel like it just gets ignored easily. And I also think, low-key, a huge reason for this is offering. And I'm just going to say it because I know a lot of pastors, they do things to keep their numbers, and they do things to keep the amount of people in the church so that they can get the amount of offering they need so that they can buy their new car or whatever it may be. That is a huge issue. Because they keep it safe, they keep their sermons safe, so they don't say anything to keep anybody out of the church. And we need to be focusing on the truth, regardless of who's offended. And if they're offended, they're not in the church for the right reason. You see what I mean?
Right.
So I think that's super important. And like you said, like even if it is the end times, we're not supposed to just stop being Christ
Mm,
like all of a sudden because there's chaos around us. Because
mm,
throughout the chaos, we're still called to trust God. We're still called to pray through it. Like if we don't have food to eat and we're starving, we are still called to trust God. And if we start if we start getting murdered, just because of our choice to be Christians, we still have to trust God through it. And like that's a form of injustice, and through it we're gonna be seeking justice. So why not? Why not justice for Black people? Like what is the difference? It's like,
mm.
why is it all of a sudden become a debate when it comes to Black lives, you know?
Right, right. Wow, you said a lot of good things. I had a comment I first wanted to make, but it slipped my mind. But I kind of want to respond to what you just said, about why it's so different for Black people. And I think, again, going back to what I said about the history of American Christianity with racism, I think what most people understand is through transatlantic slavery, at least the Africans that were brought over forcefully, those ones, they were taught Christianity, right? And obviously some people rejected it, but most of them, that's how many Black people in the diaspora know Christ. That's one of the ways. And so I think from the time that either we were taught it, our ancestors were taught it, or from the time that white people were teaching it to us, I think again they were teaching it through almost a racist lens. Because think about it, when you grew up, you saw Jesus as white, even though we know that he was a Jewish person. But the pictures we saw of Jesus were white. So, and in my head, even growing up thinking about David or Moses, I'm seeing them all as white people. Like that's just how you see it. And I think, again, subconsciously, even if we don't purposely get taught, well, Moses is a white man or Jesus is a white man, we do kind of think as white people as not even just better if you internalize racism or if you are racist, but also as more Christian, also as more whatever. So I think because of that, a lot of people I don't think want to admit that, or they say, no, that's not true. But secretly, I think it's there sometimes, especially if that's in your heart. If you have not taken racism out of your heart, I think a lot of times subconsciously we will view certain people as more important, certain people as literally just more important, more their lives that value and matter more. And I think that's also shown with the Black Lives Matter movement. Like I think now when I hear it, I think of it as a movement. But when I first heard it, like I remember the first time I ever saw it, it just made sense to me. It was just like saying Black Lives Matter, and it was clearly in a response to another Black person, unarmed, innocent, murdered by the police. And it was very clear. But however, to some people, hearing the words Black Lives and Matter, it draws up a question mark. And I love the statement where people say like all lives matter, and it's like you're agreeing with us, because if all lives matter truly to you, that means Black lives have to matter, which means if you hear Black Lives Matter, it shouldn't be a whoa, like is that of God? Like, and I think even another popular deflection is like the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not really for Black people, or more importantly as Christians, oh, like they support the LGBTQ community and they're pushing that agenda, right? And the reason I'm calling it a deflection is because the Black Lives Matter movement has been around since I believe Trayvon Martin was murdered in 2012. I could be wrong, but I believe that's from the time it's been around. Until this year, I have heard no Christian or anybody's deflection from it be that it's because it stands for the LGBTQ or whatever else. So I know for a fact it's coming from people from that time who are just like, no, I don't really want to hear Black Lives Matter. And I really have to question why. Like, what about that sounds crazy to you? What about that sounds radical to you? What in your Bible says, no, this is wrong? Like, especially if you understand, like I understand if you maybe heard of it after you heard all lives matter and you're thinking like, wait, why are they saying only their lives matter? But if you understand perfectly clear before any blue lives matter, before all these other people try to come up with all their counter arguments, that this was said specifically to what was happening in America, I don't see how you as a Christian can say that's not of God, or that's whoa, like that's not something that I can stand behind. Like I'm actually really generally confused on what the disconnect is. I don't get it. I don't get it. But I think it goes on to as to what you say. Like once it's Black people, it's political. Once it's Black people's lives, it's whoa. That's kind of like we're getting divisive here. And I think that shows. I don't want to be like overly spiritual, but I think that shows even the strongholds and the demonic spirit of racism that people don't want to acknowledge because they think it's just like a personal belief or something. Like racism is a serious stronghold, which is why it's been able to be here for hundreds of years. People are not this smart. Like, how is this such a huge issue? And it was such a huge issue in 1600s. Like, think about it. Like, I want people to really think about it and to think about why we look at Black people differently and how that's deeply rooted in racism. It's that simple. So, to continue, I remember having to say something to what you said, but it slipped my mind. So I guess I'll just move on. I think going off of kind of what I just said, and I think I kind of talked about it before with being complicit with racism, but another thing I've seen, and I think it's almost worse than people that kind of try to understand and they maybe say something ignorant. I've seen many Christians just be very apathetic and very indifferent. Like, they just don't care. It's just that simple. They do not care. It doesn't affect them. It's not on their thoughts. It doesn't matter. It's not big of a deal. I think the example you gave of like the child getting a cut and you just giving them a popsicle instead of like wiping up the wound, I think about that too. Like, it's almost, I've literally heard people say this, Christians say this, Black, white, whatever, that it's not that big of a deal or it's not the biggest problem. So you're gonna, okay, like imagine somebody in your family was murdered and somebody comes to you, well, there's bigger issues in the world. So like, that's literally what you're saying. And I think, again, it goes back to really viewing these people as people and not this like political thing. You have to really look at it and the fact that this affects real people, even if it doesn't affect you, even if it doesn't affect anybody you know personally. It doesn't disappear just because it's not in your world, you know? And I think that really has been, I think, the most upsetting to me is seeing the indifference of many people, the indifference, the apathy to, you know, the suffering that's been going on, to the real people. So many people this summer have lost their loved ones for no reason, you know, just simply because of racism. Like, and people don't want to look at that, or they want to still use all of the deflections we've talked about instead of actually thinking about how this affects real people.
Yeah, most definitely. A lot of people, I know a lot of people are numb from caring. Like, it just causes them to be numb to the point where they just can't even verbalize their pain anymore. That's understandable, but I do get what you're saying. There's just a lot of silence, like too much silence, and it's honestly disgusting to watch. I'm just keeping it real, because like the God that you serve, if you think he would support that kind of behavior, if you think he would remain silent if his own son, you know, was going through what Black people are going through right now, like if you think he would remain silent, then you're not serving the same God as me, because that's kind of awkward. And then also, performative Christians is a thing too. Like, I see this a lot in celebrities, people that just choose to use God's name as just a tool or just as a way for them to look better. And those people just aren't necessarily taking their faith seriously enough. They aren't actually digging into their word. They're not actually paying attention to the way God calls us to be. And that becomes dangerous because a lot of those people are huge examples right now. Like, a lot of Christians look up to these people, and it's very scary. So that was a good point that you brought up.
Right. Yeah. It's it's just disappointing. I think even going off of that for me, like I definitely get what you're saying. Like some people become numb to it, and that definitely did happen to me at some point. And I think that's natural. And I think it's also why you have to kind of be careful of how much content you intake of it, because obviously on social media we have a lot more access to it than we would regularly if this wasn't happening. If this was happening at a time before social media. So I think also being careful with how you take it is important. But I think more so what I was talking about were people that just don't care from the jump. It just kind of didn't matter to them, or they were just willing from the beginning to just say it's not that big of a deal and just kind of keep going. And I do wonder if, again, it does go back to the root of people not understanding racism as a sin, because I think something interesting that I learned about Martin Luther King in one of my classes a couple years back was that initially, before he was this person that was in the civil rights movement, he was just a pastor who really didn't feel like getting involved. And I don't think it's because he didn't care about racism, but because maybe, again, like the common belief, that's not really the Christian's place. Like, and so I think, again, Christians have then been able to, like, through Christ in their head, take a back seat and just be like, well, that's not really something we have to be involved with. When in fact, again, if you're seeing racism as a sin, that it is, and the reason why we say it's a sin is because it's literally you hating a person for what God created them as. So in a way, you're literally saying to God, yeah, what you created, that's not good. That's not it. And some people don't look at it as that simple, but in reality, that's really what it is. It's you simply not understanding or not, sorry, as not respecting God's creation for what it is. And so even if you yourself don't personally look at a black person or another person and be like, well, I don't like you just because you're black. If you, if you're, a white person or, another woman of color that's not black, and when a black man comes on the street, you're holding your purse or these little things are all things in your heart that you've upheld about somebody else that God created. And if you don't look at it like that, you, of course, will be able to excuse yourself from the conversation. But in reality, that's what it is. And so I think maybe that's why some Christians feel like they don't have to be involved, is because, it's to them, it's not really a sin issue. It's just a personal difference. And it's not that at all. All right, let's see. I think one more deflection I want to talk about, and this obviously is more so for Black Christians. I've seen use this, some of them, is that I'm Christian first, then I'm Black. And this is true. This should be very true. But I was also thinking about it with other things in life. Like on Father's Day, when everybody's telling you Happy Father's Day or telling you Happy Mother's Day, do you say, well, I'm a Christian first, then I'm a mother? So don't get like, or is it understood? I think the fact that people say it, again, it proves that it's a deflection, because you're trying to separate yourself from the situation. You're trying to be like, well, I'm Black, but wait, I'm a Christian first though. Like, don't get me confused. And especially when it's in response to you possibly doing something or saying something and that being your excuse. Or I've seen even people do this with even saying like stuff against police brutality is wrong. Like they're saying, well, I'm a Christian, like as a Christian, it doesn't matter what color you are, you should see injustice as injustice, and you should be able to feel very comfortable calling it out as such. So I know I've seen that deflection. I think you said you've seen it too. And it's just, why would you say it? Because you wouldn't say it in any other situation. You wouldn't say that I'm a Christian before I'm a Celtics fan. You should be a Christian before you're a Celtics fan though. So it's kind of unnecessary. And again, I think if you find yourself using that deflection, whether personally inside your heart or with other people, ask yourself, why am I needing to say this right now? Is it something I need to say, or am I trying to kind of deflect from the serious conversation that's being had?
Most definitely. And I think it also gives off anti-Black vibes, if I'm keeping it real. Like, at the start of this movement, I saw all the Black Christians posting this on their Facebook, and I was like, okay, but why weren't you saying this 3 months ago? And I was like, where are all the white Christians saying I'm Christian first before I'm white? Like, why is it only Black in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests on a national level? Like, why? So that's how you know. That's like how you know. This response is a deflection. This response is in response to your Black brothers and sisters saying that you don't claim the title as Black first. It's saying that, yes, I'm a Christian, but right now I want to emphasize that I associate myself with a Christ follower, which you are, you're a Christ follower. But you're trying to say that I'm trying to emphasize this identity over my Black identity so that I don't have to be associated with the Black people that prioritize their Black identity. That's really how you're coming off as, especially to non-Black Christians. It's obviously when Black Christians are like, oh, I don't want to be associated with other Black people that aren't Christian, because then that already comes in with the stigmas, and they're like, oh, well, other Black people that aren't Christians are drug dealers, and it's like, you don't even realize what you did there. Like, you don't realize how you are now. You're obviously not racist, because Black people can't be racist, but right now you're trying to contribute to the system that puts down your people. Like, you're contributing to that, and you don't really recognize that.
Right.
So it gets
right. And I think it's also like an example of internalized racism too. Like a lot of times that has to do with like, all right, how can I remove myself from being Black as possible? How can I, as much as possible, remove myself from being Black? And people do this even that are not Christian. Like if they're wealthy, like some people really think they can work their way up to not being affected by racism, and unfortunately that doesn't work either. Granted, you do get some type of privilege in having, the money to buy whatever you want, but it doesn't stop you from still being viewed as a Black person and all the stigmas and the racism that comes with that. So yeah, that's a great point. I think we covered most of or if not all of the deflections. So these were examples of what we believe are wrong Christian responses to racism, and all, like, this is the ones that we've seen, especially in the last few months, in response to everything. So we just kind of now want to talk more about what we believe are, the right Christian responses. So for me, I know that we already, and I've seen Christians say this, even ones that use deflections, that they're praying, but how are you praying? Are you just saying like one prayer, like, okay, God, like I pray for this to go away? Or are you really praying and asking for God to, one, reveal any racism, internalized racism inside myself? Tell me, Lord, how I can deal with other people of other colors better, like of other backgrounds, of other races better. Are you praying for justice? Are you praying for true change? Or are you comfortable and okay with the way the systems have been going now because it works for you? I think in my opinion, it has to start with prayer first, especially as a Christian. But I think we can't just say we're praying generically. Just kind of like the same thing if you were praying for somebody who's sick. You wouldn't just say, well, God, I pray that they get better. You specifically pray for healing for their body. You pray for their family. So when you pray against racism, make sure you're really seriously praying and thinking about what you're asking God. Another thing I think is a right response is protesting. I know this is very controversial for a lot of Christians, for whatever reason. I don't know why, but understand that protesting is not just going on a street with a sign. Protesting, that's one way of protesting, but there's so many ways that you can protest in your personal life. There's so many things that you can personally do, whether it be at your job or even at your church or wherever, where you can stand against racism. Like, it's that simple. So make sure that you're getting involved just past prayer, because again, with anything in our life that we want, if we want a job, we're not just going to pray for a job and not apply for any jobs or not go to any interviews. The job's not going to magically appear. We have to do something with that prayer and with that action. Do you want to continue talking about the rest of them, or I can keep going? It's up to you.
You can keep going.
Okay. So making sure that you're calling out racism when you see it, and this can be difficult and can take some practice and time. But really making it clear that where you are, you're not going to stand for racism, especially as a Christian, not just as a person, but as a Christian. Like, if you see it in your Sunday school class, if you see it in your church, etc., just be like, hey, this is not right. Like, and it's that simple. Standing up for what's right. And again, this is also not easy, and it's not popular among many Christians when it comes to dealing with racism, but standing up for what's right. And standing with the oppressed. And that could look like many things. It could be listening to them. It could be uplifting their voices. It could be praying for them. It could be supporting them, etc. Did you want to add any other Christian responses before we get into the action steps?
I think those were great. I was going to talk a little bit about how what it means to be anti-racist and how to be actively anti-racist. You want me to talk about that like after the action steps or right now?
You can go right now. I think that'd be great to tie that in.
Well, how to be actively anti-racist. I think that's important to study because it is something that you'll have to literally take time into understanding. The first step is to understand the definition of racism, which is also important, and that goes in many different levels because racism is not just on the individual level, like you stated. It's a systemic issue, it's an institutionalized issue, and it's evident in not just in our church buildings, in the school systems, in the work offices, like every single way you go, it is there. And then also understanding the real definition of racism and how it is automatically correlated to power, and how in the United States of America it's related to white supremacy existing, and how Black people who do not obtain and have the same amount of power as white people cannot be actively racist against any other race in the United States of America because of the lack of that power. It's important to understand that. The second step is to stop saying I'm not racist. Because as Christians, we don't go around saying, oh, hi, my name is Ariana and I am not an atheist. Like, you don't introduce yourself like that because you already know that you're a Christian, and by your actions, you show that you are a believer. By the way you communicate with people, the conversations you hold, you show that you are a Christian by your actions. So you don't have to specify I'm not a Christian. So don't say I'm not racist. Just with your actions, be actively anti-racist. Make sure that you don't contribute into any kind of racist conversations. Make sure that you don't contribute to anyone being like a bystander to anyone being racist and not say anything about it. And that will basically prove that you're not racist, if that makes sense. And the third thing is just identifying racial inequities and disparities in your workplaces, in the church, in schools, everywhere you are. Just identifying it and making sure that you are constantly speaking up against it. The fourth thing is confronting the racist ideas you've held or continue to hold. That's really important, especially for white Christians. You need to be able to accept how you've treated other people in the past so that you can move forward from it. And also, don't move forward from it by telling everyone, like, oh, well, back in the day, I used to be racist and I'm not. Like, we don't need to hear that story. We really don't. So please don't write a, I used to be racist and I'm not essay and put it on your Facebook page because it doesn't do as much as you want it to. The last two is understand how your anti-racism needs to be intersectional. And the last one is champion anti-racist ideas and policies. So these are really important to just consider in your everyday life. Once you study these ideas and understand it, you'll be able to recognize that they exist more places than you think. And then that way you'll be able to actively fight against it in all those areas.
Yeah, that was really great. And I think to just kind of remind people who are not maybe familiar with the term anti-racist is not the same as just being not racist, because racism, again, because it's so actively involved in every facet of our society that it's like invisible. You can't just say that you're not racist, you know, you have to be against racism. You know, it's that, so that's why it's anti-racist, because you're against it. You're not going with it. And again, to reiterate why it's important for us as Christians and not just as thing that good people should do, is because like Micah 6:8 says, he has told you, oh man, what is good and what the Lord really wants from you. He wants you to carry out justice, to love faithfulness, and to live obediently before your God. And so again, just to reiterate that these are not just things that good people should do, but these are things that Christians really need to be actively doing. And how to be anti-racist doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take time, you know, especially if you've already, or if you've previously subscribed to a racist identity. So it's going to take time. So just to get in some action steps that kind of like piggybacks off of what Ariana was just talking about is, again, like I said before, you want to pray, and again, be very intentional with your prayer. Read what the Bible says about justice. We gave some verses before, but there's so many verses that the Bible talks about justice and fighting for the oppressed. Read about verses that talk about love for one another, standing with the oppressed. Also, take time to reflect on how you may have been racist. Like I think Ariana also touched on that, or how you maybe upheld internalized racist thoughts if you are a Black person. And think about how you've maybe participated and were complicit with racism. And remember, being complicit with racism is not necessarily you doing the act of racism, but it happening around you and you not doing anything, or you almost being okay with it and being silent in that time. Educate yourself on racism. Again, many of us have been very misinformed. We have not been taught well in most of our schools about what really happens in our country and what has happened in our country to lead to this point. Pay attention to what's really going on. And what I mean by this is, don't just watch the news to find out what's going on. Don't just follow one-sided things to see what's going on. Like, really take a moment, and if you know anybody that's been involved in protests or that's involved in social justice movement, really take a moment to maybe ask and see what's really going on, and not just take what's been given to you. And then act. And act can be many things. So for example, hold your pastors, church members, family, friends, and other people accountable when they're being racist. And again, that can be simple as calling it out. You know, we would do the same thing as Christians if we saw our brother or sister falling into another sin. We would say, hey, like, we care about you. Like, this is not of God. You need to do something different. Do the same thing with racism. Introduce anti-racist policies to be upheld in your household, jobs, school, and churches. So that means like literal rules that you follow to make sure, again, that you're being actively against racism. It can't be something that you passively do. Either you're against it or you're gonna follow with it. That's how it goes. Listen and empathize with the oppressed. And at this moment, we are talking about Black people, but there's so many oppressed groups of people that we really need to take time to listen and empathize with, even if we don't personally have to live their lives. Do you want to keep talking about the rest of them, or I can go on?
I think those are perfect. I think you did a great job reading them.
Thank you. Thank you. I think so. A couple more is this: to create and join social justice groups, organizations, or participate in Black Lives Matter protests. And when we say Black Lives Matter protests, understand that not all Black Lives Matter protests are headed by the actual organization of Black Lives Matter. There's so many organizations that are fighting for change in this time. So again, that's another thing about paying attention to what's really going on. But anyways, getting involved in those protests, signing petitions. There's petitions on change.org. There's petitions on all these different websites. You'll probably see them all throughout social media. Read what they say they're for and, you know, sign it. Also, have the hard conversations with yourself, with people in your family, with people in your church, especially. I think it's important, and stand up for what is right. Some books to read. These are just some books to kind of start yourself maybe on getting more familiar with this topic and what racism really is, because it's more than what meets the eye. So there's this book by this Black theologian that recently passed away named James Cone. It's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Another book is called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, by Michelle Alexander. That's a really good book to kind of talk about how we went from segregation to integration to mass incarceration and kind of what impacts, the Black community the most today. And then lastly, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And I think we'll hopefully have the slide to show you guys this so you guys can see what I just read. So yeah, those are just some action steps. Before we end, something that I thought was important to kind of add is for the Christians that have been, in these past few months doing the work of being anti-racist or, making sure that you're having the hard conversations or being involved. I just wanted to leave a word of encouragement and advice. So one, I just want to say that you're doing a great job. Keep on going. I know there's going to be so many days, like we talked about already, feeling numb or feeling overworked and burnt out. But understand that what you're doing is a good thing, not just as a person that's doing what's right, but as a Christian, you're doing something that many Christians, I think, have feared or strayed away from doing. Keep learning and strategizing. So keep educating yourself, keep finding better ways and different ways to do what you're doing. Understand that you do not have to educate or correct people. And I think this is so important, especially in the age of social media and trolls and people that are going to bother you when you stand up for something. Understand that it's not your responsibility to do that. You can do that if you choose to, but understand that a lot of times that can drain your energy and honestly maybe even pull you into just being overly frustrated and kind of pulls you away from doing the real work. So understand that that's not your responsibility. Join with like-minded Christians. And I think this is so important because in a time like this, many Christians aren't going to agree. So try to join with Christians that are as close to like-minded as you are in this situation so that you can be encouraged and you guys can strengthen each other. Rest, take breaks, but make sure you keep on going. So that's important. You're gonna need some time to be alone. Make sure you're taking time to relax and decompress, because unfortunately this problem will not go away magically over time. We're gonna have to keep going. So it's a marathon. You gotta pace yourself. And then most importantly, stay close to God. Keep reading his word for guidance, strength, comfort, and encouragement. We have to stay close to God in this time because I don't know about many of you, but I've definitely felt very angry so many times that I've had to really pray to God to help me to channel that anger into action. I think somebody said it very well. Anger is like a vehicle, and you can use it for where it needs to take you. So if your anger is really driven by what I think the Bible calls righteous anger, which is, seeing injustice, make sure you're using that anger to take you to a place that actually does something. So yeah, that's just my word of encouragement and advice. Did you have anything, Ariana, that you wanted to say?
No, I think that's perfect. I want to emphasize the rest as well. Rest, because you can't even keep doing great or keep learning, keep understanding. You can't join like-minded Christians if you don't take care of your body.
Right.
Rest, take breaks, and just balance it out. Know yourself. Know how much you can handle. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for joining in with this conversation. We just want to leave you with a verse. And it's Amos 5, verse 24. And it says, "But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream." And I think that's just something to encourage us by, and to know that the word of God backs us up in fighting for justice and speaking out against injustice. So be blessed. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll have maybe more conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
Bye.